All right, looks like we've got a good crowd of folks wandering in slowly. We'll give it probably another 30 seconds before we get going. Well, I haven't been looking at my watch, but it feels like that's about 30 seconds, so we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody, or if you're on the West Coast or Mountain Time zones, good morning. Welcome to the third quarter webinar hosted by the ACC Young Professionals. Today we are going to be talking about Aviation Planning 101. And the two of us who are going to be moderating the webinar today are myself, and I'm an aviation planner with HNTB. My name is Max Vale, and my co-moderator is...
Hello, everyone. My name is Blanca Rocha. I do international business development at Plaza Flectors Inc. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
So a lot of you may or may not be familiar with the Airport Consultants Council, which is the organization that is sponsoring this webinar today, but we'll just give you a quick high-level overview of what is this organization. So the Airport Consultants Council is a trade organization that represents the consulting industry within the aviation space. We are unique in that we focus purely on the consultant side and not necessarily the airport sponsor, owner, or operator side. And we advocate for our own industry, we advocate for our clients, we advocate for our member firms, and we keep our members up to date with all the latest and greatest in the aviation industry. Our programming, including webinars such as this one, are one way that we do that. And then the ACC YP Forum, there is a fairly robust young professionals forum that is hosted by ACC. And it's primarily meant to engage airport professionals who are 35 years of age or younger. So folks who have usually between about 0 and 15 years of experience. We have quarterly calls. We have committee liaisons to the other technical committees of ACC. And we have various events. We have regional meetups and various other opportunities as they come up. Blanca will actually talk about some of the upcoming opportunities on the next slide.
Thank you, Max. And yeah, so a little bit of housekeeping announcements. So we have the innovation competition coming up. The deadline has been extended to September 1st. So if you have any questions, please contact Brad, and his email address is there, or Grace with ACC. We also have a quarterly call coming up for the YP Forum, and that is going to be on September 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And ACC will open the registration later this week, so you will have an email coming out for that. If you want to be more involved with the ACC YP Forum, consider applying for to be a YP committee liaison. And I believe ACC sent out an email this morning with a survey link, so just make sure you look for that email. If not, if you didn't receive it, you can contact Grace Healy, and that is her email address, or you can visit the ACC Young Professionals Forum page for more information, and that is the link as well.
And we know there's not a hyperlink, or you can't click on these necessarily, but yeah, if you go to ACC online, you can navigate to the Young Professionals Forum page, and these should be fairly accessible. All right, housekeeping over. What are we talking about today? Well, today we're very excited to have 4 esteemed aviation planners speaking today, all representing different disciplines of the aviation planning field. So we have Leah Whitfield from the Aviation Planning Group, which is a small women-owned business, and she is the president, senior aviation planner, and she is going to be talking about general aviation planning. We also have Dan Barton, who is a vice president from Intervistas, and he will be talking about landside planning. We have Talene Kirvadkar with AirUp, who will be talking about terminal planning as much as you can in 10 to 15 minutes for all these disciplines, really. And then we lastly have Reagan Schnug with Kimley Horn, who is a senior project manager, and she will be covering aviation system planning. So stepping out a bit from the individual airport and looking at the whole system. Just kind of a graphical description of what we're going to be talking about. So like we mentioned, we'll be starting with Leah covering general aviation, which is that green field kind of on the right side of the image there. This is just a sample area of Reno Tahoe International Airport. Next, we'll have Dan Barton talking about the land side. So that's your curbside, that's your parking, that's your roadways, that's your rental car center. And then we'll have Talene talking about terminal facilities. And lastly, Reagan will be talking about system planning, so how an individual airport fits in with the larger picture. And with that, I think we're ready to get going. So I'll hand it off to Leah to start her portion of the presentation.
Thanks, Max. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Actually, Leah, may I interrupt you for just 1 second?
Of course.
Sorry, I just forgot one logistical thing. If you have questions as they come up, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom window. Blanca and I will be monitoring those, and we will be saving Q&A for any of our speakers at the very end. So once all 4 speakers present, then we will start moderating the questions to feed to our speakers. Sorry, Leah, go ahead.
And yes, we
No
can
worries.
see your screen. You're all good.
Great. Thanks, Blanca. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Greatly appreciate you joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. Again, I'm Leah Whitfield. I started my career at originally at college, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, where I got 2 degrees, one in meteorology and air traffic control minor, and then I finished up with my aeronautical science master's degree with a management concentration. And while I was finishing my master's, I finished with Embry-Riddle's worldwide campus. I wanted to try out an internship, and so I got into airport management. That was really not my goal when I went into my master's program. It was to really be an air traffic controller at the time, but I landed an internship at a commercial service airport in Wyoming at Casper, and fell in love with airports and airport management. And so I stayed at Casper after my internship, and then went on to become an airport manager at the Rock Springs, Sweetwater County Airport. And so I spent the first few years of my career on the airport side before I jumped over to consulting. And one of the reasons I was really interested in consulting is because I could work on a lot of different airports, whether that was across the state or across a region or across the country. And so every day is definitely different, and has been over the last 12 years as a airport planner. So as Max stated earlier, I started APG in 2020 with my co-founder, Justin Hyde, and we're a small woman-owned planning firm. And we also do design as well. And we have a staff of about 15 across the country. And a lot of that work that we do, and especially the work that we started off with as a firm, was general aviation airports, or GA planning on commercial service airports. And so, just like any other kind of planning project, GA, covers everything from planning to public involvement. There's always land acquisition, environmental concerns, whether that's SEPA or NEPA. And then of course, now that incorporation of emerging technologies also, but general aviation airports are very unique. And when they just have general aviation, and they're a smaller GA airport, clients often have multiple roles outside of running an airport. So a lot of times they're the public works director, sometimes they're the mayor of the community, or they're a city engineer. So they've just kind of been stuck with the airport as one of their many duties. And we have a lot of clients like this today that don't really necessarily have a dedicated airport manager, but those are our clients. And so it really takes a little bit of a unique approach to get to know the client, understand the client, and help the client understand the responsibility of managing and overseeing the airport, and especially planning the airport, because they're really busy. And what do they want to do? They want to see actual work happen at the airport. They want to see the engineering. They want to see that construction happening at the airport. They want to see that pavement being repaired. And so sometimes they just don't know to take that step back and really understand and think about, we really need to plan ahead to make sure we do this in a proper way before we get to that engineering and that construction. So your role as an airport consultant really goes beyond planning. You're doing a lot of hand-holding, you're doing a lot of educating, and you're really thinking on behalf of the client, because the client doesn't know what they should be thinking of, or what, again, if they don't know what they don't know. And so that's really your job, to help them understand and know what they don't know. So of course, typical types of projects Again, we do a lot of just general advice, helping, kind of as planners, we're helping our smaller general aviation airport clients through things, whether that's document creation, to help them manage the overall airport with rules and regs, minimum standards, lease agreements, or the more typical planning like master plans, environmental assessments, CADXs, coming up with cost estimates, kind of that pre-planning formulation studies. And then, of course, that airport layout plan, and really getting them to understand that they can't do anything at the airport if it's not on that airport layout plan. That's one of those important things with our general aviation clients. And then also helping, they're trying to run the airport like a business in order for the airport to be self-sustaining and to also meet their grain assurances, helping them come up with what is that business strategy? What does that airport want to be when it grows up? Do they want to stick to being an ag airport? Do they really want to attract more corporate jets? Do they want to look at cargo opportunities? So lots of different types of projects kind of fall within that general aviation realm. And then, of course, just understanding overall FAA knowledge is really important. So understanding the advisory circulars when you're going into a planning project, no matter what type of airport it is. But what we've found is really having prior airport management experience, which most of our staff do, is really important, especially on the general aviation side. We have active pilots on staff and several prior airport managers and also some state DOT staff also. And that really helps us understand from their perspective how best to plan their airport and make those right decisions. And as airport planners working on general aviation airports, we're using our typical tools of Microsoft Office, AutoCAD and Civil 3D, Aviplan occasionally as well. And then we're also using things like SketchUp or other three-dimensional tools because a lot of our general aviation clients can't necessarily see what that might look like when you have to rearrange some buildings and some taxiways for future development. So this is where GA gets a little interesting. So project challenges, limited data. So when there's not a full-time airport manager at an airport, or even if there is a full-time airport manager, there's just really limited data out there. If there's not a tower, which more times than not, our general aviation airports don't have a tower, we don't know how many operations are coming and going. A lot of times the FBOs don't have a lot of good data outside of just here's how many gallons of fuel we sold last month. And so really trying to help the client understand that keeping as much data as possible and collecting that data is really important. But that's really important for us as planners to understand how to gather as much data as possible when we go into a planning project in order to justify a forecast or justify a change from a B1 to a B2 airport. And then, of course, justifying crosswind runways, which is becoming even more and more difficult these days. A lot of our general aviation airports just can't justify funding for that second runway at the airport. So just understanding limited data and how we can work around that. A lot of times we use simple things like game cameras. Just put a game camera out at the airport, collect that data. We talk to a lot of the stakeholders at the airport to really get an understanding. So feeling comfortable talking to whether that's pilots and kind of speaking their language, talking to the maintenance shop at the airport, but really reaching out to those people at the right time throughout that project, especially early on, to get their engagement and get that information out of them. Because again, the airport itself might not always have that data. Limited funding. So this is the #1 challenge, of course, at any airport. But general aviation airports, they just have less money. They don't have PFC money that they can play with for other projects. They oftentimes don't have their match. We had a general aviation client that unfortunately in 2020, well, actually, I guess 2019, had to back out from doing a total runway reconstruction in 2020 because they weren't going to have the match. What happened? COVID hit, funding was at 100%. So they wouldn't have even needed a match. But at that point, of course, it was way too late. And we'd already kind of come up with a plan to adapt. And so we were able to work with the client, do a small runway rehab project to really keep that runway up to par until they can set aside that money like in 2027, 2028. But really working with that limited funding and helping the community understand the value of the airport and the city or the county that owns the airport, helping them understand the value of the airport is a lot of our job in an airport planning project so that they can build out that CIP and get that design project done. And then also just planning through other challenges. A lot of times we show up to an airport There's a prime example on the screen here of a project happened, a design and construction project happened without a lot of pre-planning, and it meets the advisory circular. It fixed that direct apron to runway access, but operationally, the pilots can't make those two sharp 90-degree turns. And so really being adaptive to figuring out how can we meet the client where they are and how can we help them move forward and find a solution for them through the planning process. And then right now, of course, all the buzz everywhere in aviation is, all of our emerging technologies and how are we going to integrate these into the system, in particular with advanced air mobility. That's a big one. And general aviation airports are really looking at how can they diversify their role in the airport by taking advantage of advanced air mobility and these other technologies. So how can they get passengers flying out of their airport? And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how, especially from Reagan's perspective on a system planning level of how are the airports, GA airports role going to change within that system, whether that's cargo or serving passengers into the future. And then of course, just how can we incorporate alternative fuels into the airport? So as we know, the smaller aircraft are going to be the first ones that are going to be electric and hybrid. And maybe even hydrogen. So how can we incorporate that into our general aviation planning and making sure that we're thinking ahead for the client? So best practices, again, make their life easier, not harder. They don't know what they don't know. And so you need to help handhold your general aviation clients and really help them through the planning process and helping them to understand the importance of planning. And then yourself staying up to date on industry standards and emerging technologies. And then being comfortable speaking in public, whether that's in a small group setting or one-on-one with pilots, being able to speak that lingo and getting those pilots. They're not always very trusting of other people when they come and ask for information. And so being comfortable with that is really important. And of course, just do what you enjoy and do it well. So if your passion is general aviation and you're a general aviation pilot, GA planning can be a great niche for you. So I think if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll take them at the end. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Leah. That was very interesting. And I've never, thought about general aviation and how different it is from commercial airports. So that was very insightful. So next is going to be Dan, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about landside planning. Please take it away, Dan. Dan, we can't hear you. Let's see.
All right, here, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
All right, sorry about that, some technical difficulties there. So, can you see my screen okay? Excellent.
Yes, we can see it.
So a little bit about me, I started as a traffic engineer, that's my education. I was a roadway engineer for a couple of years and got sick of roads. They all started to look the same to me. So made the transition to aviation planning. I've been in the industry for about 15 years. And I've been with Intervistas for about 7, kind of splitting my time between master planning and transportation engineering. So I'll start with this pie chart on the right side. These are non-aeronautical revenues at airports. This goes back to 2018, but as far as we can tell, the data hasn't changed that much. You can see in green how big the parking and ground transportation and rental car portions of non-aeronautical revenues are at an airport. Parking alone represents 1/3 of all non-aeronautical revenues at airports. And it's kind of interesting to me because we spend a lot of time going to conferences and talking about retail or how to improve our concessions programs or our food and beverage programs. And yet despite all the work we put into it, that's a relatively small portion of the non-aeronautical portfolio. Whereas airports get a lot more net revenue from parking and rental cars. You might have half of a person's time dedicated to rental cars. And so all of that 18% is almost all net revenues. It's very profitable for airports. You have to look at all these elements of the ground transportation network holistically. And just to demonstrate what that looks like holistically, we can look at how transportation network companies or Uber and Lyft impacted airports from 2014 to 2019. Of course, they grew tremendously over that 5 or 6 year period. And then, and perhaps the worst timing ever, they went public in early 2020. And so there was that pressure for them to be profitable. Of course, people were scared of sharing a vehicle during the pandemic. And then there was a driver shortage. And so drivers demanded a higher portion of fares, or at least to be more profitable themselves. And so Uber and Lyft are quite a bit more expensive than they were just a few years ago. And so now we're seeing the pendulum shift. So from 2014 to 2019, at airports, even where they charged per trip fees or concession fees to Uber and Lyft, we saw a decrease of 15 to 20% in ground transportation revenues. And that was just because Uber and Lyft were taking market share from parking or rental cars or other ground transportation providers that resulted in more revenue for the airport. Now we're seeing that pendulum shift back. So this is an example of Salt Lake City on the right side of the screen. They opened a new terminal in late 2020. And they replaced an 1,800 space garage with a 4,000 space garage. And at the time, not very many people were traveling, and they thought, how are we ever going to get people to use this garage to help us pay for it? But only a year later, you're seeing a news report in October of 2021. Already, all of their parking facilities on airport were full. And of course, that's much worse now. And they're not alone in this. Every airport that I am involved with is also experiencing problems and challenges associated with how to accommodate all of this parking demand. When it comes to planning parking facilities, there's lots of principles we adhere to. This is that diagram from that Salt Lake City garage. And I'm not going to go through each of these one by one, but I'll mention a few that I think are particularly important. On the upper right side of this diagram, you're seeing a mention of avoiding a forest of columns. So when we plan new parking garages, we try to create as open a field as possible, creating a 60 by 60 grid to give you a lot of flexibility in the future regarding products that you can provide. It allows customers a feeling of comfort, just more open air feel to it. And it creates a lot of intuitive wayfinding where you can naturally see where you want to go. And that brings me to the left side of the screen where it says centralized pedestrian paths. You can see in Salt Lake City, we developed these 2 light wells. And these 2 light wells, we orient everybody towards the light wells. And once you're in the light well, it is very intuitive on where you need to go to get to the terminal. It just makes it very natural to get through there. And then the last thing I'll mention is avoiding sloped floor ramps down there in the lower left corner. You can see that we have helix ramps at Salt Lake City. The reason we avoid sloped floor ramps in garages at airports is because we have a lot of suitcases and strollers that can run away down a ramp, and it creates a safety hazard. And we want to avoid that, where you might see a lot of sloped floor ramps at downtown areas or hospitals or other things like that. So parking garages are just a small element of parking at airports. Many airports don't have a garage. And so we spend a lot of time talking about surface lots. And even at airports that do have garages, they often have economy or remote lots. So just sticking with that Salt Lake City theme, you can see in blue their economy parking. They have about 12,000 spaces back there. And then they have employee parking that they also have to consider in green. A big consideration here is you can see from economy parking and the new garage and the terminal that they're relatively close, or at least some portions of the economy garage are relatively close. You want to make sure that that line or that fence between those facilities doesn't have a hole in it if you don't want people going through your central utility plant or your rental car service area, generally not areas you want the public. And so we joke about digging a moat and putting alligators in it to separate your surface lots from the terminal as you need. Another key thing to think about is busing, making sure you have an efficient operation, locating the bus stops where they need to be, having the amenities that are there to compete with off-airport parking. Just making sure that you have a profitable business plan when it comes to a remote or an economy parking operation. I'm going to transition to curbsides. Just some really basic thoughts here. On the left side of the screen, we're talking about 1 levels versus 2 levels. So Oakland International Airport on the upper left has 3 separate curbsides, but they're all at grade. And then that contrasts with Seattle Tacoma on the lower left that has a multi-level curbside. You can see the levels kind of on top of each other there. There's lots of airports we could use as examples here. You can just see the differences there. The other thing to think about is inner versus outer, and this is Reno Tahoe. Max was showing that earlier. You can see that inner curbside right up against the terminal building. At Reno Tahoe, they've signed that for drop off or for departures, and you can see the canopy over the curbside for where ticketing is. And then they've signed the outer curbside for pickup or for arrivals. There's different ways to allocate the space or to sign it, but the bottom line here, the key takeaway is that there's inner and an outer curbside. When it comes to curbside planning, there's certain guidelines or standards. A lot of these can be found in the Airport Cooperative Research Program, or ACRP Report 40. That's a good source of guidelines for roadway planning and for curbside planning. Some things to keep in mind when it comes to curbside planning is to reduce the number of crosswalks, to try to platoon the pedestrians across crosswalks so you limit the number of delays that your drivers have on the roadways. Another is to limit the number of signs, or to at least ensure that the signage is easy to follow and people aren't overwhelmed by the amount of signs. There's certain tools out there. One of the easiest tools to use is the Quick Analysis tool of airport roadways, or KTAR, there on the upper right. That was developed as part of ACRP 40. And if you have the correct inputs, the traffic volumes and the dwell times, you can put those in relatively rapidly, 5 or 10 minutes, and it'll give you this output here on the upper right. Red is poor level of service or some severe congestion, whereas green or yellow is good and pretty much free flowing. For more complex curbside operations, we typically use VISIM, a micro simulation tool. You can see the 3D output from VISIM right there. One aspect that's often involved with curbsides is commercial ground transportation. So commercial ground transportation can involve transportation network companies. I already talked about Uber and Lyft. It can involve taxis, courtesy shuttles like your hotel, motel shuttles, rental car shuttles, and then limos and your charter buses. There's a financial component to this. Each of these ground transportation providers typically pay a concession fee or a per trip fee. You need to make sure that you're meeting the airport's financial objectives with some of these programs, and that the facilities are planned to go hand in hand with some of those fees that might be charged to these operations. On the right side of the screen, you're seeing the new intermodal transportation facility at LAX. There's an East ITF and a West ITF. You're seeing some renderings here. And you can see some of the different things that are involved, trying to orient pedestrians to the right place so that they can get on the people mover. You're seeing some buses that are parked in sawtooth configurations. You're seeing other buses that are in pull-through stalls. You're even seeing some taxis in the background. And so it's a complex ground transportation, so to speak, at the LAX ITF. In terms of roadway planning, I love these illustrations of LaGuardia on the right side. These are construction drawings, it's not all done, but you can see the complexity that are involved in these roadway networks and how easy it is for the public to get confused. One key component of this is that you cannot use standard traffic engineering standards or guidelines when it comes to planning airport roadways. You cannot use the highway capacity manual. There's multiple peak hours. There's infrequent drivers. I've seen drivers driving the wrong way on a one-way roadway loop at airports before. You have a lot of close decision points. So it's free-flowing, similar to a freeway in some respects. But oftentimes the decision points are a couple of 100 feet apart instead of being 1 or 2 miles apart. So very, very big differences compared to standard traffic engineering. The biggest difference in my mind is what you're planning towards. In standard traffic engineering, you plan for level of service level of service D. And a lot of that is because your daily commuters can plan for congestion. They experience it every day and they can plan ahead for it. A lot of your airport users are only using those airport roadways 2 or 3 times a year, and they don't know, or they don't have the experience to plan for severe congestion at the airport. And so, and also the consequence of being delayed by 15 or 20 minutes in traffic could mean that you missed your flight. And so for these reasons, we aim for level of service C when it comes to roadways. Again, a good source for guidelines and directions when it comes to planning airport roadways is ACRP Report 40. Rental car planning is very complex. I don't want to get into too many details. You can see a diagram from Grand Rapids, a new ConRac, a consolidated rental car facility that broke ground just a couple of months ago. There's been an increasing use of ConRacs, or these consolidated rental car facilities, over the past couple of years. Just about every large hub airport has a ConRac, with a few exceptions. They're acreage hogs. They require a ton of area. You have to plan for that. But one thing that I think is really interesting about ConRacs is they combine three very different elements of operation. So in this diagram from Grand Rapids on the left, you can see in orange a customer service lobby. And here you have higher finishes, you have bright and personable feel. Then you move into the ready return area, which is this parking garage kind of in the middle. That's the consumer space, very bright. They're trying to sell cars or have you upgrade your cars. It's where cars are ready to be rented and then they're returned. And on the right is the what we call the quick turnaround, or the QTA, and that's where the vacuuming, the fueling, the car washes are. Even maintenance occurs there. There's some very complex systems in that QTA. I was asked to touch on some emerging trends. One is electric vehicles. There's a big movement towards electric vehicles, and airports are doing everything to accommodate it. Some of the challenges are highlighted here, and the biggest challenge is highlighted in these two headlines on the upper right. A year ago, August of 2022, California bans the sale of new gas-powered cars by 2035. It made a lot of headlines. It was big news. Just 6 days later, on August 31st, this was the headline: California asks residents to avoid charging electric cars amid an intense heat wave. So there's a lot of irony there, of course. The big problem here is grid capacity. Our grid network does not have the capacity to accommodate electric vehicle charging on a large scale, even on a single private use basis. But at an airport, it's even more pronounced. Just for example, you can see this bar chart in the lower right. That second bar from the left, 125 kilowatts, that is the power consumption of a mid-level hotel like a Hampton Inn. That is also the power consumption of one level 3 charger. So when we talk about, I mentioned rental cars earlier, I'll use Salt Lake City as an example since I've been talking about them already. One day, the rental car companies will likely have to be all electric, with Ford and GM saying that they'll be only producing electric vehicles by 2035. If the rental car industry in Salt Lake City is all electric, they'll have to have about 200 level 3 chargers, assuming that we are using today's technologies. 200 level 3 chargers is equal to 25 megawatts. Salt Lake City Airport today only uses 20 megawatts airport-wide. So the rental car industry alone, by itself, would more than double the power consumption of the airport. And I'm using Salt Lake City as an example, but every airport is in this exact same situation. And then when you think about AAM, advanced air mobility, or electric vertical takeoff and landing, those vehicles, to charge them, would double again the electric power consumption at airports. So it's a huge, huge issue. And it just shows the need for electric master plans at airports. The last emerging trend I'll talk about is autonomous vehicles. There's lots of interesting technologies that are in test cases right now. One that's interesting to me is this picture on the upper right. That's Stanley Robotics, or Stanley the Robot. It's a autonomous forklift that kind of picks up your vehicle and parks it autonomously, and then it brings it back when you're ready to pick it up. Another one is this DFW parking shuttle. So that's an autonomous parking shuttle at DFW in operation today. There's autonomous snowplow at Winnipeg. I think what most people think about when we talk about autonomous vehicles is robo-taxis. And robo-taxis have been delayed. There's been a lot of news about them over the years. And I think it's taken a lot longer than anyone in the industry expected to get to a point where robo-taxis are on the road. But I should point out that there are active robo-taxis on the roads in San Francisco and Phoenix that are available for the public's use. They do not have drivers in them. And those two programs are Cruise, which is owned by GM, and Waymo, which is owned by Google. You do have to enter, you have to get signed up and registered, and there's a long waiting list to be involved in these programs, but they're absolutely on the streets and they do not have drivers. So robo-taxis are here. They're on the roads today. There's lots of other test programs. Another one grabbing headlines is Zoox by Amazon. And then there's test programs in nearly every major warm weather city in America, different levels of implementation. But again, the legislation and the policy questions linger. I think there's a lot of roadblocks ahead before we see robo-taxis en masse at our airports, but they are coming, and I absolutely think we'll see a day when they happen. So with that, that's my presentation. I'll turn it back over to you, Max and Blanca.
All right, Dan, thanks very much. Just a note on the AVs, I live in San Francisco and I see, particularly on weekends, a lot of the cruise vehicles going around, and it's quite a sight to see. Just a little odd to see. It feels almost like a headless person, right? It's a car without anyone in it. But yeah, no, and it's definitely going to take some time before they're eligible to operate at airports, but we're getting there. We're definitely getting there. We got some good questions that are coming in the chat, which we'll get at the end. And some of them actually tie into some of the issues that Leah brought up as well. So got some good crossover there. So with that, we'll hand it off to Talene with Arup, who will talk about terminal planning. Talene, take it away.
Hey, Max, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Can you share my screen? Or sorry, can you see my screen?
Not yet.
How about now?
Still waiting.
All right, let me try that again.
There you go.
All right, fantastic. Okay, hi everyone. Very happy to be a part of this panel. I'll just speak a little bit about myself. My educational background is in urban planning. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in urban planning. I was always interested in transportation and always focused on subjects in that area, which led me to aviation planning. My start in aviation was through a summer internship at an aviation planning firm. And from there, I never looked back. I was so fascinated by airports that I decided to get a full-time job as an aviation planner. So I worked for an architecture firm for a few years before joining Arup. Have been lucky to have worked on a lot of different projects at large hub, medium hub, and regional airports. And they have been quite diverse. I've been involved with master plans to detailed terminal design. And in all of them, I was primarily focused on terminal area planning. So while I have worked on the other components like landside and GA a little bit, this is the area where I'm most focused on. So happy to speak to terminal planning today. I want to start with the location of the terminal in the airport context. This is Terminal 5 at JFK International Airport. So the position of the terminal is primarily governed by the runway location. The runway center line is sort of the most critical piece of infrastructure at an airport. Then we have taxiways. The runway and taxiways together form the airfield. Taxiways facilitate ground movements of aircraft. Then we have the apron where aircraft are parked either at a contact gate or a remote stand away from the terminal. And there's the terminal building itself. And finally, landside, which includes all the facilities that Dan just spoke about. And there's a distinction between landside and airside. So beyond this, this is all on secure side. And no, Dan, there's no moat between landside and the apron. It's just a security fence, but that's a good joke that I heard. So before we begin the planning process, we have to recognize who are we planning for. Our clients could be government agencies, airport authorities, or airlines, or they could be private investors who may be funding the development of the terminal. These organizations ultimately serve the passengers. So passengers are the ultimate users of the facility, and there are other stakeholders such as concessionaires or airline staff or ramp agents that also use and operate the terminal. So those passengers and stakeholders are our target group that we plan for. So every terminal planning project starts with defining goals and objectives, and they vary by project type and client requirements. But at a high level, we try to consider these categories, number one being sustainability, then resilience, flexibility to adapt to near-term and long-term changes in the market, connectivity to all the various modes of ground transportation on the land side, passenger convenience, of course, provide highest level of service to them, and finally, make the terminal development create a net positive impact on the local community. So here are the steps we typically follow for terminal planning. These generally align with the steps you usually see in a master planning process. We start by assessing existing conditions on the site. Then we forecast future demand for passengers and bags that will pass through the terminal. Then we determine facility requirements needed to accommodate the forecast demand. Basically, this dictates the size of the terminal. And once we have the size, we get to the drawing board and start developing alternative concepts. We then evaluate the concepts in detail. And from the evaluation results, we select a preferred concept. And then there's a rigorous refinement process that the preferred concept goes through until we hit the design stage. So throughout this process, we perform a number of activities simultaneously. We're always listening and collaborating with our clients and stakeholders to get their feedback and make sure we're meeting their objectives. We apply best planning practices based on industry standards. We perform a lot of numerical data analysis on various terminal processes from macro to micro scale, and also perform physical site analysis, identifying constraints and opportunities for land site, terminal, and air site development, because all of these three areas are tied together. So I want to talk a little bit about how do we go from forecast to facility requirements. I'll keep this at a high level. First, an annual forecast is developed for future airport activity. This includes forecast of aircraft operations and number of passengers. And from the annual forecast, we select planning horizon years, typically targeting years at 5 to 10 to 20 years from the current year. Once we have the annual volumes, we look at the design day, which is typically an average day of the peak month, the busiest month in that year. We then develop flight schedules for this design day and use the schedules to assess peak hour demand for various passenger segments like departing, arriving, and connecting passengers. To assess the peak demand, we use spreadsheet models or simulation models, or a combination of both. And using and applying industry standards for a level of service, we then determine the facility requirements, which gives us the number of gates and the amount of square footage that the terminal will need to accommodate the demand. So now let's talk about what happens inside the terminal building. I spoke about the square footage, but there are, of course, many areas inside the building we need to think about. The primary function of the terminal is, of course, to move passengers and bags between the curbside and the gate. And as passengers, we go through a series of processes along this journey, and so do our bags. So if we look at the departures flow, we start with check-in facilities. That's where we drop off bags, and the bags go along on their own journey. We then head into security screening areas. There is outbound passport control at airports outside the US, but in the US, departures, domestic and international, go through the same process. So then we head into security screening, and beyond that, we're now on the secure side. So once there are dwelling areas like concessions and hold rooms. Hold rooms have seating and boarding elements. That's where we wait and then board our gate. And looking at the arrival side, if it's an international flight and if the terminal is capable of accommodating an international flight, then you'll find immigration facilities there. If there are no, if we are on a domestic flight, we head straight to the back claim. And beyond that, we go through a customs check. Again, being an international passenger, have to go through that. And then we're back to the non-secure side, where we may have concessions, landside concessions, and we then end up at the arrivals hall where we are ready to be picked up by our friends and family on the curbside. You'll notice that restrooms are spread across both processes on both secure and non-secure site. And just a little bit about baggage handling systems. These areas are largely hidden from the passengers. They consist of systems like explosive detection devices, conveyor belts, and circulation spaces for baggage carts that carry bags to the aircraft. In addition to these functions, we also have to think about support areas. These could range from office spaces for airport staff or airline employees, and for government agencies like TSA. We also have to provide storage spaces for concessions, and then there are numerous back of the house areas for building operations like mechanical, electrical, and IT equipment storage areas. And there are some other secondary amenities like a pet relief area. So all of these functions, we look at them individually and we determine facility requirements for each of them separately. And then we combine it together to come up with a single program of square footage for the terminal. Once we have the program and we know how many gates are needed on the terminal, we start producing alternative concepts. The concepts vary depending on whether it's a new terminal or expansion of an existing terminal. So on the left, this is an example of a new terminal. You can see the processor with different concourse configurations, Y shape, plus shape, X shape, linear configuration. There can be many different forms in that area. And then this is an example of an expansion project where there's an existing processing facility of the terminal and we're just adding gates to it. So we add a concourse by either a single pier with gates on both sides, or we even could provide a satellite concourse, which could be accessed via an underground tunnel, or there could be a busing operation to carry passengers from the main terminal to the concourse, or there could be an automated people mover, which is a train that carries you from the main processor to the concourse. So after going through a lot of different concepts, we always evaluate them at a very in a very detailed manner. I've just listed the high-level categories that we typically look at. These could be airside or landside capacity, passenger experience, operational efficiency. Phasing is a big part. The terminal has to be developed in a phased manner so you don't disrupt existing operations, and then ultimately the cost effectiveness of the concepts. So as you can see, airport terminals come in very many different shapes and forms. There's no one size fits for all solution, so you have to always look at every airport in its own unique fashion. So going back to what I showed earlier, I showed you the new terminal for T5 at JFK, but this is an old aerial of the old T5 terminal. You can see the processor part of the building here with two concourses sticking out. And then if we overlay the outline of the preferred concept that was selected for the new T5, you see the size difference and the shape being quite different than what it was before. So now it's a single long pier with gates on both sides, and the size of the processing elements, the facility that holds processing elements has significantly increased compared to this area. So to give you a sense of how a preferred concept goes from a sketch to reality, here are some sketches of the new T5 concept. This is the airside layout with gates, and we also have sketches for the interior of the building with all the functional areas I spoke about earlier laid out within the building. So once we have the concepts, we continually go through the refinement process until we get to a detailed site plan. And we also simultaneously refine the interior color block plans of the terminals so that all the functional areas within the terminal meet the program that we have defined earlier in the process. So going through this refinement, we then enter the design process. This is where architects and engineers get involved, and together we still collaborate with them until we reach the construction stage. So this is the final result. You can see the original shape of the building is largely retained in the final construction, but there's there are a lot of refinements that we go through to get there. So while we're developing these terminal concepts, we perform a lot of spatial analysis, passenger flow analysis. This includes vertical circulation between multiple levels, walking distances across the building. We think about wayfinding strategies, making sure that it's intuitive and passengers don't get lost in the building. We also look at airside interface, which involves gating and boarding bridge configuration. So this is an example of a flexible gate that can accommodate 2 narrow-body aircraft in the same footprint as one single large wide-body aircraft, and we use the same bridges to board them. So it's an example of a flexible gate that we see at a lot of international terminals that could operate as domestic and international. We also look at interterminal connections. We look at passenger flows between terminals and including baggage flows, and study how long it takes to get from one terminal to the other. And also on the land side, we look at the land side interface, considering how the departures level and arrivals level interact with the drop-off and pickup curb. The departures level is usually on the top and arrivals at the bottom, but the curb could be organized in different ways, but we have to make sure that they're properly aligned. So I want to take a minute to emphasize the importance of sustainability in the planning process. This is something our clients have been actively focusing on, and the FAA has committed to creating a sustainable aviation system by 2050. So a lot of our clients have been looking at various sustainability strategies. I think Leah already touched on a few, Leah and Dan, but I'll just reiterate, just switching to renewable energy sources and monitoring energy consumption. And I'm speaking about this in terms of energy consumption within the terminal building. We also try to prioritize public transit as much as we can. And of course, the big electrification of different vehicles. So we have to make sure that we provide infrastructure for all the charging that is required for electric vehicles that are operating at the terminal, and also provide infrastructure for alternative fuels like the sustainable aviation fuels, also known as SAF. As terminal planners, I would say we really need to think what facilities does the terminal need to support these sustainable strategies. Dan mentioned the big push on electrification, and this is true for terminals as well. On the apron, you'll see that a lot of airlines have been using electric ground surface equipment, the equipment that serves the aircraft when it's at gate. And to charge this equipment, you need to provide charging stations on the apron. So that requires, infrastructure in the terminal area to supply power to those charging stations. And the terminal building itself, if it's going through a lot of electrification, then we need to provide the central utility plant and to provide sufficient power supply to the terminal building itself. I won't get into the details of all the technologies. I think Leah and Dan have already touched on some of these. Advanced air mobility, from terminal context, we have to think about how to accommodate eVTOL operations. Where would they land if the passengers are coming to the terminal? I think aircraft design innovation is a critical one. We are seeing a lot of companies out there looking at new aircraft designs. This is called the Flying V here, the image that you see. So when this aircraft comes at the terminal, we need to think about how do we design or plan the airside interface so that the aircraft can be boarded from our existing or future terminals. On the inside, biometrics, a lot of airports have already used biometrics to screen passengers. There are augmented reality technologies. These are mobile apps for wayfinding and obtaining live information. And autonomous systems also exist inside the terminal building. I'm showing an example of these baggage bots that could replace some conveyor belts and get us some space savings inside the terminal. Just want to end on saying that planning is a very forward-looking discipline, and the aviation industry is always changing. So we have to be flexible and adapt our planning practices to keep up with these changes. With that, I will end my presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Talene. That was a good kind of overview of everything that entails, you know, terminal planning. So staying up to speed with the ever-changing aviation system, it's very important. I think not just terminal planning, but overall, we're always having to adapt. So thank you for that. Next, we have Reagan, and she's going to be talking to us about system planning. Take it away, Reagan. I
No audio.
think no audio.
Nope, not yet. It was working earlier. Nope. No. Stand by, everyone, while we sort out some AV issues. And AV meaning audio video, not autonomous vehicles in this context. No, can't hear you. If you disconnect the headset, would that? Nope.
Maybe try unplugging if you can. Oh, okay.
Nope.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
When in doubt, use the cell phone.
All right,
Sorry,
whatever.
everyone. We did
Whatever works.
earlier. Not sure what happened. Anyways, and you can see my screen still?
No,
No.
not yet.
No. Try that again.
Yep, we can
Can
see
you
it.
see now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, let's try this again. Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks to ACC for having me. I'm looking forward to talking a bit today about aviation system planning. But before I do that, I thought I might share a little bit of my background. I am a graduate of Michigan State University, so go green to any of my fellow Spartans out there. I have a degree in urban and regional planning, and I was fortunate enough to have an aviation internship early on in my college career where I got to work on a variety of planning assignments for general aviation airports as well as some small commercial airports. And I worked on master plans, ALPs, and even some environmental work. And after graduation, I started full-time in aviation consulting and found what I was really interested in and was able to hone my skills in system planning, along with some other planning specialties. And I've been doing it for about 15 years, just over. And in my role now, I have the opportunity to work with many states across the country on their system plans. And I get to lead and mentor other aviation planners, which is one of the highlights of my job. So what is aviation system planning? Well, Max briefly touched on the scope of a system plan and that it is planning at the macro level. And the best way to describe it, I find, is as a master plan, but at a regional or state level. And it includes many of the same elements of a master plan, like inventory, forecasting, and identifying development needs, but it's done at a macro level for an entire network of airports and therefore is less detailed. It does cover the same long-range planning horizon of 20 years, and they typically include all public use airports. Most often those are also publicly owned, but some states do have privately owned airports that are open for public use, and they will include them. GA and commercial airports are both included, and some even include heliports, spaceports, and seaplane bases, depending on where you are. And a key element in the system planning process, which I'll show later in the presentation, is to classify airports by role, because we understand that not all airports serve the same purpose. System plans are used to understand the relationship between airports and the system, as well as the relationship between that aviation system and other modes of transportation, like transit and rail. And a small note here, but important, states are required by the FAA to have a system plan to receive funding. At the onset of a system plan, we establish goals to help guide the advancement of the airport system. Example goals include safety and security, sustainability, that can be environmental, social, financial, or all three. We often set goals for community relations and business development, among others. And as you've heard today from a lot of the speakers, we've seen a shift and a need to consider emerging technology and what that means for airports and for airport systems. So we've heard about electric aircraft, we've heard about electric ground vehicles, we've heard about sustainable aviation fuels and advanced air mobility. And we include a look at those emerging technologies on the system as a part of the plan. And it's important to note that these needs are generalized in a system plan, usually by airport classification, those roles I was just talking about, and then needs on an airport-specific level, like the needed power load, for example, for a specific facility is not assessed. And one of the most important outcomes of the system planning process is identifying the development needs and the financial resources required to achieve those. And the plan will often identify costs associated with maintaining existing infrastructure and what's needed to expand and adapt to the anticipated future need based on forecasts as well as industry advancements. And oftentimes, we include individual airport capital improvement plans in the analysis. One of the graphics here shows that the 10-year CIP needs. So a lot of the projects mentioned by my other panelists today are also reflected in a system plan. And these plans can help states or regional governing bodies prioritize projects needed at their airports. We know that the needs almost always outweigh the available funds, so difficult decisions need to be made, and a system plan can help with that. And some states even use inclusion in a system plan as a criteria in their rating of projects. So for example, if a project helps an airport achieve a system goal and increase performance, it will receive higher priority. System plans serve a really important role and really serve as a link between airport planning at the federal level through the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, or NIPIAS, and the local level through master plans and airport layout plans. And they're used in many different ways for different reasons by different people, as illustrated on the slide. For example, master planners might use a system plan to identify projects recommended by the state for a specific airport, or they may review an airport's role in the larger aviation system. They may compare forecasted activity. And the FAA will use the system plan to understand the state's priorities for development and the financial requirements of those projects. But there are limitations. Typically, aircraft or activity forecasts in a system plan cannot be used in a master plan. They can be used to compare what has been developed in a master plan, is it higher, is it lower, that kind of thing, but they can't be adopted wholly as a master plan forecast. And the system plan will outline what the state thinks is important from a system-wide level, but that local airport level planning and analysis of needs is still required. And the system plan likely won't include some of the nuanced local issues or needs, like equipment needs or specific timing, exact timing of projects. And it likely won't consider the financial feasibility of projects based on an airport's local situation, like a master plan would. System planning has gone through multiple eras over the last 50 years. I debated including a Taylor Swift joke in here about the eras. The system planning eras are vastly different, but I will refrain from that. But here, this slide really shows the evolution of system planning through kind of 4 distinct periods. At first, system plans were highly focused on development and expansion, wanted more airports, more runways, more infrastructure, and we also saw the first guidance from the FAA be issued on system planning through multiple advisory circulars. In the 90s and 2000s, we moved into a period of preservation where the system plans were focused on maintaining all of the infrastructure that was developed in the previous decades. And we also saw the initial use of technology in the planning process, notably the emergence of geographic information systems, or GIS, which really opened the door to more advanced spatial analyses. And in the 2010s, we shifted our focus to accountability and the performance of a system, and the performance of airports within that system in meeting identified goals and objectives. And the plans focused on transparency of how needs were identified and how investment of federal and state dollars were helping advance performance. And in this latest era, we're seeing an emphasis on integrating emerging technology, of course, the opportunities, as well as the challenges of those technologies into the system planning process. And we're seeing the development of electronic and web-based deliverables, such as performance dashboards, that accompany the more traditional documentation of a system plan. This slide here outlines the general flow and process for developing a system plan. This was adopted from the FAA's advisory circular. And as I mentioned previously, and if you're familiar with the master planning process, you'll note that many of these tasks are similar, and at a very basic level, they require a collection of a significant amount of information through site inventories. For many of these, we will get out on site to almost all airports. So you're talking, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 plus airports. You can imagine just the level of effort that's required just to gather the data. Then the assessment of that data against goals and objectives, and then the identification of needed improvements. Some elements, though, are entirely different from a master plan, and an example of this is the development of alternatives. A system plan might consider different scenarios, like the financial needs for a maintenance scenario versus an expansion scenario, and by that I mean what's required to maintain the existing system infrastructure versus expand to meet greater capacity needs. Another example is the consideration of scenarios related to industry changes, like how would a state react if the GA fleet mix shifts from predominantly single-engine piston aircraft to jet aircraft? Or what if a state that relies heavily on regional airline service, what if that airline service is reduced? How is the state going to react, or the region going to react to these potential scenarios? And so those are some of the things that we achieve kind of in that alternatives analysis step. And then at the end of the system planning process, it's common for a variety of deliverables to be created and published. There's always a comprehensive and detailed technical report, but let's be honest, not everybody is, dying to read a 300-400 page written report. I guess maybe if you have you know, need some reading to help you fall asleep, maybe you'd look at that. But there are many other documentation or ways of documentation and different deliverables that are used and are being shared with a much wider audience. So we're seeing a lot of executive summaries, of course, for quick reading, individual airport reports that are tailored to each system airport. And a lot of times the airports that receive these, you know, if they're smaller, this may be the only kind of marketing collateral that they have. They don't have the funds to hire anyone to help them develop kind of these materials. So it's really important for them. We've also seen the development of fact sheets for different audiences, like elected officials and airport sponsors. And then the GIS dashboards or websites that we're seeing kind of the emergence of in the last few years that can provide real-time performance data. Beyond these deliverables, additional implementation measures might be taken, and hopefully they are, such as coordinated public rollout. We're seeing a lot of social media strategies and videos to let stakeholders know the project has been completed and what's available to them, how they can use it. And we're also hoping for the meaningful inclusion of system plan findings in the larger long-range transportation plan of the state or the region, recognizing that aviation is one mode, and the needs of aviation of airports in the state need to be considered alongside the needs of, say, highways, for example. And implementation of the study results is just as important as the development of the plan itself. So working with each client to understand their needs and priorities is vital for a successful project. With that, I think I'll hand it back to you, Blanca and Matt.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Reagan, for carrying us through. At this point, we've gone through all 4 of our speakers' presentations. And so at this point, we'd like to open it up for some Q&A. We've got some great questions that have come in through the chat, and several of our speakers have been diligently issuing responses to them. So feel free to check out some of those answers as we go. And if any speakers, feel free to, you know, take a look at the answers, and if you want to add anything or verbally talk through any of those, feel free to drop in. Let's start with one of the questions in the chat, and I'm actually going to kind of generalize it. It was targeted toward Talene, but I think it applies to all components of the aviation system. So a question is, what is an example of a private investor project at an airport? And then kind of as a follow-on to that, who is driving the project, whether it's an investor or an airline? How does that impact project considerations? So I think the most obvious instance where that comes up is terminal, you know, if it's a privately funded terminal by, say, an airline or so, but it can come into play for landside facilities as well, certainly rental car facilities. That's the one that I can think of, but anyone feel free to step in and speak about this.
Yeah, so yeah, terminal is correct. Airlines fund terminal development, but there are also private operators of terminals. This is not very common, or historically has not been common in the US, but in other countries, privately funded and operated terminals are pretty common. And in the US, I think D4 at JFK is operated privately, and I think even the new Terminal 6 will be operating in that model. So it's typically known as design, build, and operate model. So you fund the development of the terminal, and then you end up owning it and operating it for airlines. And the second part of that question, which is who is driving the project, this is never just like one organization. There are multiple entities we are catering to, while as consultants, we usually have one client, but we do have stakeholders, and those stakeholders have their own clients. So we often act as moderators as well, where we are balancing needs of one stakeholder with the other's needs. So yeah, it's I don't think it's just one entity. It's prioritizing the needs of every stakeholder, and then figuring out how can we meet those needs with the terminal development, because there are many moving parts, financing and whose gates are going to be on this terminal versus the other side of the terminal. So it's a balancing act.
Max, you referenced rental car facilities. There's been a dozen or more rental car facilities that have been built by private entities in the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And airports do that for two reasons. One is because they feel perhaps that they can't generate the necessary funding for a large project that might cost $500 million for a CONRAC. That's just a general number, but the other is to eliminate risk or to reduce risk. Now we're seeing a little bit of pushback on both of those ideas. Rental cars can fund projects. You just have to go into debt for them oftentimes. And it's, going through a bonding exercise to do that. And then risk, the airport is going to have risk on any project, even if it's privately funded or TBO'd. So there's pros and cons to that approach, the privatization approach on any project. The last thing I'll say is that several airports have explored privatizing parking facilities. That one's a little trickier. I don't know that anyone has moved forward with it, but it's the same idea of funding and risk. Those are the two key topics.
I think for general aviation, one of the big ones, of course, is just private hangars. And, helping educate the client on understanding what the FAA will pay for and what they won't pay for, because that's changed in recent years. When it comes to pavement maintenance, we're doing a taxi lane project right now. And so there's no private hangars there right now, but the plan is that there are some investors that want to come in and develop hangars. So we're able to use our NPE funding to develop a taxi lane now for future development, but then the client has to understand that there's going to be restrictions on maintaining that pavement moving forward because it's going to be too close to that private investment. And so just really focusing on educating the airports on what's going to be eligible now and then what's going to be eligible in maintaining the infrastructure moving forward is one of the key things for private investment at GA.
Perfect. Anyone else wants to add anything else before we jump to the next question? All right. Okay, and I know Talene is working on answering a couple more questions, so we'll go to the next one. Are there a general analysis of how the design of terminals evolve over the years? I feel like there are it may be an interesting thing to see general patterns from the 50s versus today. And this is from Lee Sutanto. So I'm guessing this is probably towards Talene as well.
So yes, there has been certainly a lot of evolution. I mean, in just recent years, terminals pre 9/11 versus post 9/11 have drastically changed. Because security was inside the terminal building. Going through security was non-existent before 9/11, so you didn't have to provide areas for TSA and all those checkpoints. So after 9/11, you had to add those in, and same goes with, I would say, aircraft technologies also influence a lot of the terminal design. So size of the aircraft is a big factor in driving the overall square footage within the terminal. So if you go from a narrow body aircraft that was previously around, 150 passengers to now they have been growing longer and longer and adding more seats. So we're going up to 200 passengers, and you have to then figure out, okay, the terminal if it's an existing terminal, can it accommodate that level of demand? So you have to figure out, ways to expand the terminal or renovate it so you can provide more seating and more hold room space. So I haven't really, I'm pretty sure there are books that document historic terminals. There are aviation enthusiasts all over LinkedIn that show pictures of old terminals and how things were. I mean, the JFK T5, if you look at the old TWA head house, which is still there, now it's been repurposed to a hotel. I think they've kept some of those check-in functions just as a historic, element. But yeah, they have evolved quite a bit. So you can find that.
Yeah, just a little bit. And that's just on the curbsides. Not a lot has changed. You still need to drive up to the curbside and pick up or drop off. And so on the ticketing, where we've seen a lot of the ticketing requirements shrink, the curbside requirement stays the same. And so that's caused a lot of challenges when it comes to terminal planning. On the bag claim, there's the opposite. Bag claim devices haven't changed very much in 30 or 40 years, right? The technology isn't changing and the curbsides aren't changing. And so you have to kind of look at how the curbsides and ticketing and bag claim interact, and that plays a big role in the terminal planning.
We had a couple questions that actually came in about UAM or AAM, advanced air mobility. Historically, it's been also known as UAM for urban air mobility, or basically it's a kind of an industry buzzword these days. And Leah has typed some questions or some answers to the questions in the chat. But frankly, AAM is a topic that touches all four of what our speakers have talked about, all their disciplines. So I think let's spend a bit more time talking about that. And anyone, any four speakers, feel free to share your thoughts on how AAM or UAM adoption is going to influence the particular area of planning that you're a specialist in.
So I know I spoke about airport terminals, but AAM is also focused on providing these or accommodating these eVTOL operations in dense urban environments. So we may actually need separate, eVTOL only terminals that are operating in cities, and we have to come up with, a concept for those facilities. So I've worked on multiple conceptual designs for such facilities that can really handle large scale eVTOL operations. And the approach towards planning those facilities is the same as terminal, where we think about, what is the demand, how much airside real estate do we need to provide for those eVTOL landings and takeoffs, how many gating positions, if at all, our facilities gating those eVTOLs, how many do we need? And then that influences the size of the facility itself. But the challenge is you don't have a massive piece of land like at airports. We're now, in a very dense urban environment, so we kind of go vertical with that, and the design completely changes. So the planning approach, the planning thinking is still applied, but these eVTOL operations, while they are like helicopters, they can create some new needs, like the electrification, the whole explanation that Dan gave about how much demand it generates. So where do you provide all the electrical grid and the infrastructure needed to support that kind of electrical demand? So you need to think about on those lines too.
I like that a lot. I think a big question is where these skyports or vertiports go. And you have to think about the airspace implications, because you can't have eVTOLs crossing any flight paths. And so in a terminal environment where there's multiple runways, that's a really big challenge, is to figure out how to get eVTOLs into where you want them to be. But if you can get them into a terminal area, for example, and you're connecting them to flights, where does it go in the terminal area? You could, I've been involved with discussions. Could you put it on the roof of a terminal? Could you put it on the roof of a parking garage? And in that case, there's extra loads that have to go into the design of those facilities. And you want to blend it into the environment around it. So there's a lot of considerations on how it fits into that airport environment.
And in our master plans, for both GA and commercial service airports, since there is a lot of uncertainty right now, I think the key consideration is just making sure that if you can find a spot to support advanced air mobility at your airport, making sure that it's not blocking future development, and that future development isn't also blocking potential to offer advanced air mobility services, whether that's takeoff and landing and charging, and then really looking at that electrical infrastructure and talking with clients about how can they take advantage of solar or other renewable energy options now that can support their ongoing operation and reduce their energy costs. And then in the future, they're going to be ready for that electrical capacity or that electrical grid increase in can't spit that out, but you know what I'm trying to say. They'll be ready for it. They'll have the capacity. There we go. So we've been thinking about things like that, and then also just making sure when we're planning a vertiport at an airport, I'm just kind of planning for extra space, since there's still a lot of uncertainty about the size of the aircraft and what the final standards could or couldn't be. And then we're also looking at like how we incorporate this into commercial service terminals, and looking at like swing gates, kind of what we were talking about earlier, whether it's domestic to international, secure to unsecure. Taking a page out of Alaska's book, they have a lot of air service that's air taxi, and it's not on the secure side of the airport. So how can we incorporate that more and more into the lower 48 and offer those services without having someone go through security?
Perfect.
Reagan, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was going to say that on the system planning side, we're looking at airports. I talked about airport roles. Leah kind of alluded to it early on in her presentation. Are we going to see specific airports fitting a role of becoming, supporting AAM or UAM over other types of like traditional activity? It comes down to the location and how does that activity integrate with the activity that's already in the traditional airport system. We're also, as a part of our inventory, asking airports, are you planning for this? I've seen a few questions come in, perhaps from some general aviation airports about how do we plan for this technology? Where I think some of it, I think there are probably a lot of folks on the phone that have maybe thought about it, but they don't have a plan for it or anything like that. And so through our system planning work, we're trying to kind of spread that message and get people thinking about, hey, this is coming. Do you have any plans at your airport? Have you guys gone through, any of the prior planning? Have you talked to any of the, the companies that are going to be providing these services? Have you thought about the electric infrastructure that you need? So even if it's just to get an inventory of, hey, 10% of the system airports, this is like top of their mind and they're on it and they have a plan for integration. I think, of course, the overwhelming majority right now, what we've seen have not planned for it, but I think we're going to see that change a lot in the future.
Thank you, Reagan. And we have a couple questions that are kind of related to kind of electric and green environmental questions. So I'm gonna say both of those, and then whoever wants to answer them. We have like 2 minutes left. How do we accelerate the transition to electric and green hydrogen flight? Aviation's only true zero emission solutions. And then the next one is, why is LOS used instead of VMT for curbside transit evaluation? Was a parking garage expansion from earlier just induced demand?
I can cover the one on curbside. With curbside, level of service measures the congestion or how many vehicles or what delay is there on the curbsides. Vehicle miles traveled measures how many vehicles are driving over a certain distance. And so in the curbside environment, everyone is driving kind of the same distance. So VMT isn't tremendously valuable unless you're evaluating a completely separate curbside in a different location.
Dan, can I just step in and add something? So CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, now requires a VMT analysis for all roadway projects. And VMT is a different measure of roadway performance from level of service, but that is something that we're seeing more of. And the reason that Blanca asked both of these, I think, is because VMT instead of LOS does tie into the environmental considerations. So sorry, just wanted to say that.
Well, you're exactly right. If you're involved in an EA or an EIS, you do still have to do the VMT calculation. I just say that usually there's not much of a difference when you're evaluating curbsides. So you're still required to go through that process though. Yeah.
And then I'm going to interrupt. I think we are out of time, but we wanted to thank everyone for joining us. And should you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Max or myself. And also Grace at ACC. We flashed kind of her email address a couple times. So thank you so much to the speakers as well. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks.